The deeper problems with Path of Exile 2, Part 2. With the same background footage I used in Part 1 because I genuinely thought I'd be able to keep this video under an hour, and well, look how that turned out. Let's see if we can keep it under 2. Alright, so we talked about friction and RNG already. We'll be touching on a few more things regarding that a little more. But right now, what we need to talk about is agency, player agency, or the lack thereof. So I already talked a bit about the passive tree, dumbing down the no choice of life nodes, too many dead travel nodes with no connects, and everyone essentially taking all the same damage nodes. Basically meaning that the game is balanced around everyone having essentially the same level of damage on trees, so there's no real getting ahead of the curve regarding the tree. And it's the same thing with sockets, which are, arguably even more RNG than before. Maybe, I guess that's debatable, but it's pretty damn RNG. So that leads into, again, all the real power increases essentially being behind the items, which further underscores the hyper RNG aspect of the game. But it's worth noting that they decided to leave yes on the tree, so it's kind of no surprise between that and the prevalence of chaos damage that just about every endgame build is going ES right now. Even ones that normally would never in a million years look to go ES are now looking to go ES because you can simply scale your survivability much, much higher. But I want to talk about a few more things regarding player agency. So when you're leveling, because everything is now been further tied to RNG, you don't really get anything from over leveling zones anymore. Like previously in PoE 1, if you were feeling weak or you had a difficult boss fight coming up or something like that, you're playing hardcore for the first time, something like that, you could always over level a zone and get a couple extra gem levels, another good passive point cluster, get a bit of an HP boost or a nice little damage boost or a nice mastery to give yourself a nice little power spike, which would make that boss fight a little bit easier. Since gems are now tied to the uncut gem system and are now drop level restricted, and there is no 3-to-1 recipe for gems, you can no longer over-level zones. Which means if you're feeling a bit weak or something's not working out, your best hope is to just pray to fucking RNGesus that you get good items, from the RNG systems in the game. And if you don't happen to get good systems, don't happen to get good items, then you're kind of shit out of luck. And this also has the side effect of, well, not even side effect, main effect of creating a very high variance experience for the player. If you happen to get some good items early on, good items for the build, you're generally cruising. It's also why there is a bigger difference almost in leveling subsequent characters in PoE 2 than in PoE 1. Because merely just having a shit ton of gold to buy, all the best vendor items in PoE 2 is actually arguably a bigger difference between that and a fresh league start than having gold rim, wanderlust, tabula, etc. in PoE 1. There's no choice left there. There is, it goes back to the whole, you need to pull the slot machine lever over and over. If you're not having a good time, you need to pull that lever faster. You need to pull it, more quickly. You just need to do things faster. It's really the only avenue you have. This combined, again, with the passive tree being completely anemic, means that actually getting the levels means less. So again, back to the items. All the power essentially comes from your gear and sockets. You also can't get low-level gems, which is absolutely baffling to me. It's like they didn't even play PoE 1 and didn't even understand how their own game was played. It genuinely feels sometimes that the PoE 2 devs like never played PoE 1 in any meaningful capacity. Like using low-level gems just so you can get the basic effect with a low stat requirement is a very key thing in PoE 1. Like, just about everybody, doesn't matter what league you're playing, hardcore, softcore, SSF, non-SSF, everybody has a cast on damage taken setup in their goddamn links. And almost everybody with that cast on damage taken setup is using a couple gems in there that are low level to reduce stat requirements. So they don't have to get a shitload of some off stat that they wouldn't normally need when they only need the effect. I ran into this issue on this build right now that you're watching right now, the Gas Arrow Deadeye, when I realized exactly how much int Flame Wall took. When I was still leveling, and I'm like, okay, I just need the basic Ignite effect. The damage of the explosion is based off the Gas Arrow itself, not based off the Ignite. So all I need is the Ignite effect, and I'm stat starved because of the stat choices we've already discussed that they've made in this game. So I just want a level 1 Flame Wall. And I wound up, having to create a new character in order to get a low-level gem because I could not, I literally could not get a low-level gem on a high-level character. The ones that were dropping for me were high-level only, and there is no way to de-level or select which gem level you actually want. So there's just another example of like a bit of agency there has been removed for no real reason. Other things, Ascendancy being unchangeable is just fucking weird.
Quite nice.
I don't understand what they were thinking with that. It's one of those things where if Ascendancy was changeable in the same manner it was in PoE 1, unspec all your Ascendancy points and run lab again, no one would have complained or argued. Like, no one would have played PoE 2 and gone, gee whiz, I wish my Ascendancy was unchangeable. I wish it was hardlocked. And this just seems like one of those decisions that is purely made to get players to play the game longer. Be like, oh, you want to play a new class? Oh, you can't, you can't just respec one of your existing characters. You need to go level a whole new character and go through the campaign again. And this definitely has been a thing that they've been pushing in PoE 1 for a while. Like, not overtly, but if you've played PoE 1 enough, you will have noticed that they generally seem to, over time, consistently be making decisions to try to extend the player base's playtime as much as possible, to try to drag things out. And by the way, those drowning orbs, like that one right there on the screen, those should not be in the goddamn game. Those really should not be in the goddamn game. I don't know what they were thinking when they took a major boss mechanic and added it to like just normal white mobs where it just insta-kills you if you're in it for 1 second too long. It's a horrible mechanic, and it's just one of those just like, why things. Like, why would you ever do such a thing? So yeah, restricting something like that, the Ascendancy changing, when no one was asking for it and no one would have even thought of it, like literally not a single person on the entire goddamn planet would have been like, Ascendancy should have been restricted if they had been restricted. It's just one of those changes that makes no sense other than from the perspective of deliberately disrespecting the player's time and trying to draw things out as much as possible. On the itemization front, we have runes being completely unchangeable. These are supposedly supposed to be a bit of a benchcraft replacement, especially regarding fixing your resists in the early mapping stages. But they don't really work very well because you can't change them. No one's asking for you to... You can, like, destroy, I think, the gear to get the runes back, but you can't destroy the runes within the gear. And the runes are basically free. They drop way, way, way more often than you actually use them. So you wind up with a piece of gear which you put certain resists into in order to balance your resists at the time. Then you upgrade a different piece, and now your resists are super super over on one and super under on another, and you want to swap out those runes for life regen or something like that, and you can't because for some reason this system is rigid. I am expecting this to be changed relatively quickly, probably within the next month or so. They will probably be some way to change runes, but it just begs the question of why the hell was this restricted to begin with? Like, did nobody ever play the maps and realize just how, you know, rigid this system is and how annoying it is to deal with when you wind up with 150% lightning resist and like 60 cold, and you can't just swap one of your like 5 lightning resist runes around because 5 hours ago you were starving on lightning resist and you needed those runes just to get the cap. It just doesn't make any sense, and it just is not another one of those systems where it's just this giant step backward from PoE 1. We also have more mandatory affixes. Like this would have been a great chance for them to say remove move speed as a roll on boots, and instead make an implicit that goes up with eye level or something. So that when you start leveling, the early boots you get are like 10%, and then when you're at maps you have 30% boots, and then when you're at endgame you get 35 or something like that. Instead, not only is that there, but we have probably the single most offensive mandatory stat that I've seen in either game so far, well, aside from move speed, which is the charms, the extra charms. I'm pretty sure that everybody, myself included, kind of assumed that charm slots would be unlocked naturally as you played through the campaign. You would get like, one early in the campaign, another one midway through, and one at the very end. But instead they tied it to gear. And not an implicit or anything, where you just have to get the higher base type, but they tied it to a suffix roll, which is just puts yet another like super mandatory stat where any item that doesn't have this one stat is of significantly less power than items that don't have it. Like nobody uses boots with like 0, 5, 10 move speed or so. Like the lowest move speed people will even really consider in PoE 1 is like maybe 20% early on in the league, and that's if it's an exceptional boot. Like if you find like an insane boot, but you're like, it's 20 instead of 30, like you'll suffer through it until you can get a proper 30% boot, but it's still going to be something that's going to be relatively high on your priority list to replace because of how important that stat is. So this charm slots suffix just adds even more into the gear pressure. The whole you need stats, resist, evasion or energy shield, rarity, flat damage, life if you're not an ES build, move speed, etc. It's just this really long growing list of stats where it's like you hit maps and you're like, I need every single one of these stats. I think the attributes is arguably one of the worst offenders, because normally in PoE 1, you don't really need a lot of attributes on gear in early mapping, unless you're, playing like an attribute stacking build or something like that. But just having the right amulet type and, getting the nearby 30 nodes on the tree, maybe with a single benchcraft somewhere, you're usually good. But actually needing like relatively large amounts of attributes on gear on top of everything mentioned has really kind of, the demand on gear is very high. And again, as I talked about in the previous video, the gearing is essentially pure RNG at this point. No bench crafting, no meta mods, no essence harvest, conquer exalts, no nothing. It's just the pure RNG system, the original Sin system that from Path of Exile 1, because apparently the devs believe that the original system is perfect and infallible and will be substantial, and that the problems are that the gear level has been increased through the crafting to make the dropped items not really good. The dropped items aren't good because there's too much deterministic crafting in PoE 1. The drop items aren't good because there's too much RNG in the original system. The number of items you need to pick up in order to get a good item is obscene. So in addition to all this, the game in general is just overall much less of a sandbox than PoE one, and this ties into a lot of skills designing to be interacted with another or comboed off one another. Once you start designing skills that must be comboed, say something like Essence Drain, Contagion would be like a PoE one analogy. Whereas we're looking at this Gas Arrow, Flame Wall right now. You kind of force people to use all those skills in combination. Now, granted, there's obviously going to be a lot more skills added to the game. Adding skills to the game is the one thing GGG does do well. Whether those skills are actually balanced is a whole nother story. But there will be a lot more added to the game, so that's one of those issues that will probably be mitigated a bit with time. But it does seem like that there are archetypes that you play, and then you use all the skills that are relevant to that archetype. And this also goes into the whole gem system that they've pushed, which generally I am in favor of, the whole decoupling the sockets for the skills from the gear. But again, the way they've implemented it is not exactly that great either. You can't switch your gems very easily in PoE 1. Yes, your 6-link was tied to your gear, but if you wanted to try a different skill gem, all you had to do was at most rechrome your item. And if you're just, swapping from one bow gem to another, it's probably not going to be that difficult, because you're probably swapping from a green gem to a green gem. You maybe just have to rechrome one or two support slots, unless you're using a ton of off colors. It's not going to be too bad. In PoE 2, if you're an endgame and you want to try a new skill, you need to 5 or 6 like your whole new skill, which means actually experimenting with skills in endgame is kind of crap. Like, the only real time you can actually experiment is when you're in early mapping, when 4-link power is essentially what you need, because getting 4 links is relatively easy once you start mapping. It's rough in the campaign, really RNG in the campaign. You get the 1 guaranteed jewelers. You're lucky if you see another one before maps drop. I got really unlucky with them, but of course once I started mapping, I started seeing them like crazy. But it's much harder to change things around, and you have this more synergistic skill system combined with the dumbed down passive tree, and just overall a lot less choices to make than PoE 1. And it doesn't really feel like the sandbox ARPG that PoE 1 was, and it actually feels a lot closer to Last Epic, where it feels like, yes, the devs put in this skill and it was meant to be used with the X skill meant to be used with Y and Z and so on, and you use all those 3 together, and if you don't use them all 3 together, then your build is going to be significantly weaker. More on agency. Probably my biggest pet peeve under this one. You can't chain the same goddamn map anymore. You can't chain the same map. If you had some, layouts you really enjoyed, or maybe you wanted to farm some div cards, and there's not even any div cards in PoE 2, at least not yet. And we don't know if they're going to add them yet. Last thing I remember them saying is I think they were still undecided. But when it comes to layouts, you can't choose the layouts you enjoy at all. With the new Atlas, you are essentially forced to just click whatever's next in your path, and you can choose a different path, but it's just the same RNG. Eventually you're going to run into an augury and you're going to have to complete it. You don't have a choice in that regard. And if you're the kind of person who enjoys just running all the random maps, and you don't really particular to every layout, that's fine. You probably don't think there's a problem with the system, and that's a perfectly valid opinion. The problem is that that's the only way to play now. Previously in PoE 1, if you wanted to run an assortment of random maps, you could. If you wanted to run the same layout, 5,000 times because you just really, really love Moon Temple, then you could do that too. And that choice is now gone. So people in the, don't care camp, they obviously don't care. And people in the do care camp, they obviously, don't care about the randomness and do care, There's this very big divide there where the agency has now been removed. You don't have that choice anymore. On top of that, they have kept what are, in my eyes, to be the worst league mechanics in PoE 2. You know, where's Harbinger? Where's Incursion? Where's Delve? If you really, really love Expedition, Ultimatum, you know, and Ritual or whatnot, you're probably like, oh yeah, this is great. And especially if you hated the previous ones I mentioned. But I like Incursion. I like Incursion a lot. It's a bit underpowered in PoE 1 in the current state. But, you know, if you're in Trade League, you can still make a lot of money. I made an incredible amount of bank last league I played just selling double Corrupt Temples for multiple Divines each. And, you know, same thing with Delve. I really enjoy Delve. I enjoy Harvester. I don't enjoy Expedition. I've never liked Expedition. I don't enjoy the amount of pointless, you know, setup with the explosives you have to do in the maps. I don't enjoy the random stacking of the mods and the potential worrying about having to click a mod that, you know, your build can't handle. I don't really care for the whole reading mods like that and setting them up in the middle of the map. It's not an interesting mechanic to me. You know, granted, you know, some of the other mechanics I mentioned also have a bit of reading and whatnot. You know, you do Incursion, and you have to, you know, read and see which rooms you're going to pick, but this feels like a much more substantial choice than Harbinger, which your end result is, you know, essentially the same. It's just the bunch of currency that you get that you can then just use for the pure RNG NPCs that GGG has fallen in love with. So there's so many league mechanics in PoE 1 to choose from, and it feels like they've kept all the worst ones. And the other beauty about PoE 1 that we had, at least in the last year or so, the last couple of years, I don't remember exactly the date that they implemented it, was the ability to block certain league mechanics. If you don't like Expedition, if you don't like Ritual, if you don't like Ultimatum, you can block them right off the start. Like, literally, the blocking nodes are at the very beginning of the Atlas tree. Before you finish, like, Tier 2, Tier 3 maps, you can have them completely locked out and get bonus chance for the ones you do enjoy. But PoE 2 is like, no. You will eat your Ritual, and you will like it. You will eat your Expedition, and you will like it. That choice, that player agency, is nowhere to be seen. It's less of a sandbox and more of, this is how the game is now. You better enjoy it. Period. So it comes down to, do you enjoy what they've picked? Do you enjoy what they say is a vision? And if you happen to enjoy things that they haven't picked, such as me, then you're not going to enjoy the PoE 2 league mechanics very often. I've always thought Ritual was dumb, mainly because I always forget to check the damn rewards. You know, at the end of the map, the amount of times I've left a map without checking the rewards is, you know, just, yeah. I got tired of that. I'd rather do other mechanics like more Expedition, especially because Ritual doesn't really have any unique rewards to it per se. Yes, I know there's the Ritual specific bases, but those tend to be very, very build specific, and they aren't like, you know, a generic good base that like such as, say, a Vermilion Ring is or something like that. So they have in my eyes kept all the worst ones, and on that we're going to segue into the discussion about Ascendancy Trials. PoE 2 makes even the biggest PoE 1 lab hater, you know, shed tears over long lost Izaro. And I miss his fucking voice lines too. Like the fact that we lost like Izaro's voice lines and all his wisdom, you know, getting a bit of a philosophy education while you're running lab was always a little fun thing. But the new labs are just completely and utterly soulless. Like, one is basically just Sanctum, the other one is basically just Ultimatum, except they seem to have they seem to have not understood the original design behind these mechanics. Sanctum was very much designed around mobs that were designed specifically for Sanctum. Like, when Sanctum came out, the mobs that were in Sanctum were made in such a way that they were very, very telegraphed in their attacks. You know, no hit runs are a thing in Sanctum. So, like, you had mobs essentially designed around that fact. And it was very much about, like, you know, careful dodging and careful positioning. And the new Sanctum mobs don't really feel like that. They just feel like, you know, just random mobs that were inserted. And the whole thing feels very, very, very uninspired compared to the original Sanctum. It feels like some kind of cheap knockoff. That being said, it's the better of the two, because I think that the Ultimatum trial is one of the worst things in the game right now. So first off, this defeats the entire core concept of Ultimatum, which was that you had waves of increasing difficulty with stacking modifiers that made things more dangerous. And once things got too dangerous, or, you know, the rewards were no longer good, you could just peace. And now we have the lab based around Ultimatum, forcing you to run, you know, a certain number of Ultimatum waves, which are much, much longer than the waves were in the normal Ultimatum. Much more tedious. And you can't peace out. You can't peace out. You either finish the whole thing and get your ascendancy and finish the lab, or you... I shouldn't even call it a lab anymore. You either finish the trial and get your ascendancy points, or you get nothing. You know, the rares that are offered from them are, of course, complete garbage, because they suffer from the original sin issue, which is that the item system's bare RNG laid naked is complete motor trash. And it's just ridiculous. It's ridiculous in terms of the difficulty presented. It's ridiculous it's ridiculous because of the RNG of the difficulty. Like, lab was always a very constant difficulty. Like, the only variables in terms of how difficult the lab was how much you juiced Izaro, you know, whether you wanted the extra keys or not. And again, going back to the whole player agency thing, you had a very high amount of control over that. You could, you know, juice him and get your key, or you could not juice him and skip out on the key if your character was feeling weak or something like that. That choice is now gone. You know, you have to just pick the shitty Ultimatum things and just hope that you don't get too fucked by RNG, because if you do get too fucked by RNG, you need to bail and start over, because you won't be able to complete it. So these are mechanics that just should have never been lab. They should have never been part of the Ascendancy. They weren't part of the... They were optional content in PoE 1 for a reason, and that's fine. And it's worth noting that, you know, even though I've said, you know, multiple times I fucking hate Ultimatum, I actually do enjoy Sanctum. I actually like Sanctum in PoE 1. When it's an endgame thing that, you know, I can have a character that's specifically tailored for it, you know, to run quickly, etc., etc. You know, have good single target for the endgame boss and so on. Like, it's a fun mechanic. I did a substantial amount of Sanctum farming as well in the last league I played. But as it stands right now, Sanctum in PoE 2 is just something that you feel like you're just suffering through. It's not something that's really that enjoyable to run. It just feels like a weird, cheap knockoff of the original Sanctum. So another thing, going back to the PoE 1 lab, is the rate at which you could take it. Like, original PoE 1 lab, there were essentially two ways to tackle it. You could either take things slowly and avoid the traps, you know, if you didn't have good life regen or phys mitigation on your character, or good movement speed. But if you had, you know, one or multiple of those things, you could take it quickly and, you know, just run through traps and minimize your damage by just only being exposed to them for a short amount of time, rather than avoiding them entirely. That choice is now gone. Sanctum literally kills you in one room if you're too slow, although I will add on that this is probably one of the easier rooms in Sanctum once you realize that once you hit the Death Crystal, it indicates where the next one is. But the point sort of still stands. It's like, it feels like there's only one way to tackle things. You either do things the way the vision prescribes them, or you get screwed. There's, again, less choice there. We have... Okay, and another thing that I think really needs to be hammered home regarding the both Sanctum and Ultimatum is that both of these have stacking difficulty. Both of these. Oh, a little side thing. This right here, this life sprig that I just found here in this map, this is a really big, this is a bit of a red herring here. So I found a life sprig in a 69 map that, because it's dropped at a higher eye level, it has, and a lot of these weapons have skills baked into their implicits now. It has a level 16 mana drain and requires level 66, making it the most useless life sprig to ever exist. Now, this is an easy fix. This is something that will probably be fixed within a month or two, where they will make it so low-level uniques are locked to the lower-level version of the item base or something like that. But the reason it's like, sorry, I mean, not red herring. Red herring is not what I should have said. It's red flag. It's a bit of a red flag is what I meant to say. Because the reason it's so bad and it bodes so poorly for the future of the game is that it means that not once in all of the internal testing they did in PoE 2 did a single developer play PoE 2 to maps and map long enough for a leveling unique to drop. And it doesn't take that long for a leveling unique to drop. You know, a couple hours of mapping, and you're pretty much guaranteed to get at least one low-level unique of some kind. And it should have been really obvious that, hey, this should be locked to a lower item level because it's completely useless when it drops like that. So the fact that this even made it into their public release of the game, where it is a bit alarming, because they should have realized this. That this means that there wasn't a single dev that played long enough for to notice this issue, or if someone did, they weren't listened to. I'm not sure which option is, which scenario is worse, but neither bodes particularly well for the future of the game. Like, the devs just never seeming to actually play PoE 1, and if they did, it always felt like they were just generating characters at high level, you know, with very powerful gear and doing their testing like that. Was a big criticism I had of PoE 1 for a long time, is that like it just very rarely felt, when you read their patch notes, you would just ask, you know, do they even play their own game? And this is one of those things where it just makes you go, it's like, maybe they just don't play their own game. You know, maybe they need to take a month off from, you know, adding content and adjusting things and just play the damn game and run into all the thorny issues that are so evidently obvious. But, you know, I mean, that's a whole other story. PoE 2 is supposed to release by the end of 2025, and I don't think it's going to make that release date, or if it does, it's going to be in not a good state. I think this game is at minimum 3 years away from being properly released with, like, as a proper game. I think if they release any sooner than, you know, like something like late 2027 or some shit like that, then we are not going to get we're going to get something that's essentially very similar to what we're looking at now, and I don't think that's going to have anywhere near the long-term playability that PoE 1 did. And I think a lot of the people who are not very critical about the game right now, you know, the people who are still freebasing copium or just in straight up denial, or even the people who, you know, genuinely think that they're having a good time, and, you know, I think a lot of these people are going to be singing a very different tune in several months without major changes. Now, granted, GGG is probably going to be going into full damage control mode over the next couple months, and we're going to probably be seeing a whole bunch of changes. But the whole point of this video is about discussing the deeper issues which aren't so easily fixed because they would require a change in philosophy and how GGG sees the game. Alright, enough with that tangent. Back to the trials. I only had one more thing on there, which was that, yeah, they had both trials, Sanctum and Ultimatum, have this RNG stacking difficulty layers, where with PoE 1 Lab, difficulty was very consistent. You know, you had a high amount of control over how hard Exile was, and he was very much a constant. I mean, really, the only variable in how difficult the lab could be was, or how annoying it could be, is how long the rooms were, how many rooms there were that day. And that was just, you know, that just varies the length. It doesn't necessarily vary the difficulty. I mean, there's like one really, really annoying trap room. You either know which one it is or it isn't, but again, they're all trivialized with good life regen or good move speed or good fizz mitigation or some combination of all three. But yeah. You also have some highly questionable bosses in lab right now. Again, going to the whole constant with Azaro to, especially the ones in Ultimatum, like the bird boss is just, the one with the tornado is just ridiculous. When I first got to lab in Ultimatum, I tried to do it at about the same level I was, and my character was not particularly strong at the time. I had been kind of unlucky with gear for a little while, and I was doing it at level. And it took me several attempts to get lab down, and when I finally did get it down, it was because the boss changed to the one that just teleports around like crazy, which took forever, but it was a relatively easy boss compared to the bird, which really likes just instigating you out of nowhere. Now again, you know, that's a balance issue which will probably be tuned, but again, you've got RNG bosses in there now, where lab never used to be RNG. It just underscores the whole philosophy of just RNG being just deeply saturated into PoE 2 down to its core. You know, RNG is always a big part of ARPGs, but PoE 2 is a game literally carved out of RNG and RNG alone. And anything deterministic or having any amount of player control is deemed bad and is not included in the game. One more thing about stacking difficulty layers. GGG seems to really love this shit, where you get like one damage mod and then like another damage mod and then so on, and they keep stacking, because just about every one of the mechanics that had that in PoE 1 is included in PoE 2. You know, you have Sanctum eventually, you know, stacking more and more damage mods as time goes on. Ultimatum, stacking more and more damage mods. Expedition, stacking damage mods as you explode more things, you know, magnifying even more in logbooks. You have even Delirium Simulacrum, you know, stuff like that and so on. They seem to really love these RNG stacking damage mods. They seem to think it's good design, which is something that just completely baffles me. Especially, you know, as a hardcore player, it's something that is sort of anathemical to the idea of hardcore in general. But and you wind up having to approach, you know, these mechanics much more carefully because of it. But yeah, they seem to think it's great design, as opposed to stuff where it's like, you know, you roll the map and then choose your mods and then you go into there. The progressive cumulative damage stacking is something they seem to really, really like for some reason. Endgame. Let's talk about the endgame. The Atlas makes no goddamn sense. I don't know what the hell they were smoking when they came up with this thing, but it may be the worst Atlas we've seen in any iteration of PoE 2. You know, I would take Shaper, Elder, fucking Influence, Ping Pong, Elder Ring bullshit, you know, with Mass Sextant stacking over what we have right now. I mean, hell, the way towers work right now is essentially just Sextants anyway. But I want to talk specifically about how the Atlas functions here. I've already mentioned quite a bit when talking about other things that you have no choice, again, no agency. When picking your next layout, you basically have to choose whatever node is next in front of you. So you have no agency there. But just the way the whole thing functions is just absolutely miserable. There's no zoom. As far as I know, there's no way to reset the Atlas or anything like that. Maybe when you defeat the Pinnacle boss, it resets something like that, but I don't think it does because probably would have heard about that by now. And it's just an endless amount of scrolling. I mean, right now I don't have to do very much scrolling because this is, relatively early in mapping, but it's just a lot of scrolling. But hey, guess what? It looks like a civilization board, just like, GGG trying to do the whole board game, their favorite board game that they last played, being hammered into the game. We saw this particularly egregious in, what was it called? Synthesis. But Synthesis was at least an interesting concept. It wound up being a kind of an odd league, mainly because of the restrictions they put on everything, especially because of the pieces. They put way too many restrictions. And I think it was like a really good concept that was implemented really poorly. But this concept doesn't even make any sense. Like, you can't even run the same node twice. Like, if you run a node where you're like, oh, I liked that layout, and you wanted to run it again, well, too damn bad. You can't run it again. You have to find a new one and deal with whatever layout that was. So, yeah, the whole thing makes zero sense. Like, I find it very difficult to believe this was designed by the people who made PoE 1. Now, we've heard stuff about like how the current endgame is supposed to be a bit of a placeholder. But if it's a placeholder, then why didn't they just use one of the old atlases from PoE 1? Right? Like, why didn't they just quickly design the exact same thing from PoE 1 and just be like, yeah, it's a placeholder? They have designed something completely new here. You don't design something completely new as a placeholder. You use something old as a placeholder. So, I think this is very much like what they thought like would be good design, and it's just not. It's horrible design. It's absolutely horrible design. I was watching someone who was pushing pretty far on ladder and had unlocked a lot of maps, and I was watching them scroll around the atlas, and it took them like a literal minute to scroll from to scroll from the starting ziggurat all the way to where they wanted to go. Like, you can't zoom out. Like, and even if you could zoom out like all the way, like, endlessly, it still wouldn't be enough. That's still not good enough because the fundamental design of the atlas is just shit. So yeah, you've got the overall layout of the atlas being bad. You're forced to run shit layouts. A lot of these layouts have a bunch of ridiculous backtracking or whatnot. Some of them, will be less bad once you learn the map and learn how to clear it. But there are some really egregious ones, especially in combination with the whole hunt down the fucking rare thing that they've got going on. Map bosses were good. They gave maps identity. They were additional reward for additional risk, and so on. Like, and they were something you had to think about, when you rolled your map. Like, if you're running a core map, you're probably going to avoid putting GMP on that map or something like that. There was a bit of thought being put into that. And that, of course, is now gone. And we are just left with this completely soulless, tedious, hunt down the last rare in the map, which really, really makes people, like, double and triple down on movement speed. I'm playing a Deadeye here, so that's a bit better in that regard because it's one of the faster characters in the game right now. But yeah, like I couldn't imagine like doing this extensively on a character that has much more limited move speed because it's absolutely obnoxious. So they definitely need to get rid of that. And again, it's one of those 2 steps back kind of things. I would say 1 step forward, 2 steps back, but I'm having a difficult time seeing where the steps forward are here. It's simply just 2 steps back, removing the map bosses and the rare thing and whatnot. Strong boxes. Strong boxes are now skip boxes. I maybe did about half a dozen of these or so when I started mapping before I just hadn't lost patience for them and I just started skipping every single one. It's again just another like 0 steps forward, 2 steps back. Why did you take a mechanic that was perfectly fine in PoE 1 and then you just make it completely useless in PoE 2? Now, of course, you've got less move speed in PoE 2, so maybe there needs to be more of a delay before mobs spawn, so you have time to dodge roll out of the way. But again, this is also kind of a problem with dodge roll not having phasing. You know, phasing was one of the first new things that they added to PoE 1. It was added relatively early in the game's life. I can't remember exactly when, but quartz flasks are pretty old. And then we later got additional sources of phasing, you know, such as Abyssals, at least until they screwed that up as well. And, yeah, so it doesn't make sense that they think that not having a way to path through mobs, especially when mobs are, like, they're mobs that are faster than you and can surround you, it makes no sense why they thought that was good design. Skill balance is still totally all over the place, but I'm not going to harp too much on this one because, you know, it's the kind of thing that could change over time. You know, this is one thing that, unlike a lot of the other things I've talked about, which are deeper design issues, this is skill balance is generally just number adjustments and is relatively easily fixed, which is why it's so obnoxious that skill balance is so bad in PoE 1. So yeah, I mean, if you've played a lot of PoE 1 and understand how bad the skill balance is, you'll understand why I kind of have very little hope for them doing proper skill balance in PoE 2. But, you know, again, at the same time, it is the easiest thing for them to fix by far. Like 99% of the time, fixing a skills balance is literally just adjusting a couple of the numbers. You know, adjusting damage, projectile speed, AoE sizes. There are like a dozen little knobs that they can easily turn. But yeah, they don't really turn those in PoE 1 except when they turn things down. And when they do, they turn like 5 of those knobs down and gut something into oblivion. The PoE is filled with skills that were good for 1, maybe 2 leagues before they were absolutely like hammered out into the dumpster and have essentially never seen the light of day again until you wind up with a league with a lot of power, such as Harvest or Affliction, and then those skills start coming back out again, but they're being carried by the overall power of the league itself and not because they are innately good skills. I already talked a bit about how the pure RNG gearing leads to a high variance experience, you know, but so I'm not going to hammer that home anymore. You either understand that or you don't at this point. But yeah, because everything's pure RNG, you know, you can find like a really good weapon right when you start mapping and have a great time, or you can be struggling picking up and transmuting dual string bows for the next 2 days before you get a good upgrade. It's all just pure RNG. There's no, you know, putting together like a mediocre weapon using, you know, essences and benchcraft or something like that. It's just, you know, pull that slot machine more and more and more until you get what you want.
Toxic rain. Not yet.
And at that point, I think my footage is about to expire soon, so I think that's probably a good point to break it up into the third video, which hopefully won't be 48 minutes like the previous 2 are. I said I didn't want this to be a 5-hour video. I was hoping we could keep it under 2. It looks like it's going to be about 3, because yeah, I'm about 2/3 through my list, although the last third shouldn't take as long. But yeah, that's it for part 2 right now. Next video, part 3.